Cool. Thank you. So the talk for today is GitHub Guardians at GitHub, and we'll be diving into a few of the security, I say, assurance controls we saw that are missing in some of the default GitHub accounts. But a brief introduction before we get things kicked off here. Myself and Dileep.
Hi, myself Dileep. I'm an application security engineer, and I work on many projects that revolve around different areas of security. And I'm more passionate about vulnerability management and solving or designing security solutions. Thanks for welcoming me to the BSides Las Vegas, and this is my first time here.
Yeah. And so Dileep and I are both part of Copart. Dileep focuses on the application security side. I'm heading up the overall InfoSec function, so definitely not as technical as Dileep, so he'll be answering some of the questions you guys got probably towards the tail end of things there. To better describe the problem we're trying to solve is right now, if you have GitHub, particularly you have the non-enterprise version, there's some core functionality, security functionalities that are actually missing from that. And you can get those from getting the GitHub enterprise version, but MFA is one of the things that we absolutely had to have. I mean, there's some things you can probably give on when it comes to credential scanning and some other pieces, but you have to have MFA at least from our use cases that we had internally. Also, on-prem was a strong nice to have that you don't have that option unless you have enterprise. And then also, probably maybe the kicker, for the number of users we had within our environment, it was about $100,000 a year in order to be able to maintain GitHub Enterprise. So this is the problem that we were trying to solve, and I think we have a few others that were probably trying to have the same struggles as well. To be give a little bit more color to this, one issue we came across was with credential management, where developers and alike would be embedding plaintext credentials and also access keys right into the code. Also, leakage of intellectual property, where a lot of times that we'd have our developers not being malicious, but sometimes just forgetful or just not even practicing good data hygiene, they would open up the repo and it'd be open to the entire public. So that was another risk we had. I think there's a lot more breaches for this in the past year or so, particularly around Amazon S3. But I think there's a few issues. I think Apple had an issue with the GitHub, if I remember right, maybe about 6 months ago, and there's probably going to be a few more in the next few months or so. And then also, how do you actually secure access to GitHub itself? So this is where that multi-factor authentication piece comes into play. Talking about credential management, as I mentioned before, a lot of developers, not being malicious, they don't have a lot of solutions instead of embedding the credentials, username, and passwords in plaintext into the repositories. So that was one of the biggest problems. I think we saw a lot of movement in this space because we developed this probably about a year and a half ago. And in the past year and a half now, you probably see a lot more options for this if you want to pay. But we want to solve this problem as well. How do you ensure that the credentials are actually secured? So you can make sure that maybe they're encrypted, but how do you know that they're not using a different solution or not using your authorized one? So this was another problem we were looking to solve too. And last but not least, we have a team of several hundred developers. So how do you ensure that that each developer is actually having, sometimes they have their own rules. They may have this safer non-prod, another safer like prod, or developers have their own solutions, right? If you're in you've grown a lot from mergers and acquisitions, they have their own products and solutions in place too. So you have to be able to come up with some customized reporting. That was one of the other issues we had with a IT group that's about 500 people strong. And leakage of intellectual property. As I already kind of touched on before, but right now there's tons of repos that are being exposed to the internet right now. And they're leaking everything from credentials to access your environments, but also any type of intellectual property as well. Depending on your organization, this may be more pertinent than the credentials. It just kind of depends. I think I already kind of touched on that point. There really was no great solution to secure it by default. In some cases, we come with some features that allow you to click a button, and you can do it for like ensure no public repos at all, but that's not really manageable for a lot of organizations. You may have some repos that have to be public. So you don't really have, I'll call it a manageable solution for most companies. And insecure access to GitHub accounts. We were finding a lot of issues with password reuse, and this is where we're actually able to use GitHub Guardian as well to help us out with that piece, and particularly when it comes to MFA. That was one of the biggest pieces, but also around API key management. We have some service accounts that aren't able to use MFA. How do you actually ensure that your developers are actually properly managing their keys, that you're actually rotating out maybe on an annual basis or whatever policies you guys stand up internally? And managing of stale accounts. I think I already kind of touched on that piece too. So there's a few solutions that are available. The first one I talked about was can pay 100K a year for a GitHub Enterprise. I don't know about you guys, but I think I'd rather spend my money somewhere else if you got 100K. There's plenty of other products or even people you can probably use there. Second, third-party solutions. We saw, like, especially in the last year, there's a lot more players in this space that are able to solve some of these problems, but not all of them are doing all of them. Like, we found a lot of players, and you can just Google them too, that are doing like credential management for GitHub, and they're charging like $2 a user. I mean, I thought that was actually kind of expensive for just doing that one function. And there's tons of more players in the space just in the past few months to year or so. And then third is to develop our own in-house solution. So we went with number 3. So the solution that was developed, GHG. For legal reasons, we had to change our name multiple times, but we settled on GHG when things were all settled in. With GHG, we're able to ensure that no plain text credentials are available in code. And right now, as soon as a developer actually does make a commit and actually has plain text credentials into that code, we actually can send an alert. We're working some improvements right there, but now this has been really helpful for us. In fact, when we first started this, we found quite a number of plain text credentials. We had to turn this off before we can get everyone up into place, and then we were able to start actively monitoring for that piece. Private repositories. I already beat this one to death about talking about repositories are not publicly available, right? And then enforce multi-factor authentication. And this kind of goes back to the other piece, because if you actually are familiar right now, you can enforce multi-factor authentication, but you have to do it for all the accounts. I'd say it wasn't manageable multi-factor authentication. So this is one of the other problems that we're looking to solve with GHG as well. So to recap, the features we included within GHG, so you can see like everything that we're including, is multi-factor authentication, credential scanning for both username and passwords, and also access keys like stuff you'd find in AWS. Third-party management of vulnerabilities. This is actually an interesting that when Dileep was actually creating this tool, we didn't have a use case for this, but what happened was probably about a year ago when the Apache Struts vulnerability that came out, one of our developers came back and said, hey, I know we're using Apache Struts, can you just tell me, and it's vulnerable, can you just tell me where it's at? And we didn't really build GHG to be able to do that, but within about a day or so, Dileep was able to make a few modifications to it and was able to tell the developer, like, here's a list of where we actually have all of our vulnerable versions of Apache Struts. So it's kind of like the tool kind of evolved over time when we started having it in production and working with the developers, and they saw the value of this too. And then fourth, private repo enforcement. So if someone actually does make your repo public, GHG can go back and automatically make it private. And we have a few configurations that you can tailor to, and we'll tell a few more details around the stories of how we actually got there and made it actually usable. So with that, I'll transfer things over to Dileep.
Yeah, so what do GHG do about multi-factor authentication, right? Like, what, as a tool, as a solution, what does it do? So MFA enforcement, so that itself says that whenever a user, like, if you are not using an enterprise account, suppose you're using a regular organization account, and then if you want to add a user to this organization, you don't know whether you have MFA enabled on his account or not. So unless you add him to the organization. So that's an issue right now we are facing across. So who is actually going to go there and then see whether this user have MFA or not? So GHG is an automated solution that just actually looks into the organization, and once you add these users, like, it finds out if there is no MFA enabled on his account, it's automatically going to delete that account or remove him from the organization. And this is what the access and lifecycle management is. And then for the credential scanning, so how do we identify plain text credentials, right? Like, there are a lot of false positives when you try to scan across the code in GitHub or any of the repos. So for this credential scanning, right now we are focused on AWS keys because most of our applications uses AWS as a third-party solution for at least email sending services or whatever it is. So this GHG, what it does is it actually looks for AWS keys like access key IDs and all within the code, and then alert us. There can be like a lot of false positives in it, but then how can we fine-tune it? So we were able to fine-tune it by using like the configuration properties, or where do we keep all these in the XML files. So look at only the XML files and find out what are the access keys and what are all stored in that, and then alert us. So it is, right now we are around 90% of like not having false positives, and we are good with the solution. And then the other thing is like finding out the third-party solutions, like we mentioned, like Josh mentioned before. So what safes does developers use in the prod environment and non-prod environment? So is there any authenticated solution that we are going to propose that use this as a common across the whole environment? And then managing vulnerable third-party libraries. So this is similar to what do we do for AWS keys. So it looks for any of the Apache struts like Josh mentioned, and then finds out the version numbers in there. And then we can actually say that, okay, so this is the version number, and then is it vulnerable right now within the like globally known CVE or any databases that you know. And then you can get the version numbers and then compare it with what are all the projects you have in your GitHub, and then say these are all the repos or the applications that are vulnerable to this specific issue. And then we got the detailed reporting. Once it sees that this is the vulnerable version within this repo, it can actually send out an email to the people. So we have covered all these in the demos in the further slides. And then private repos enforcement. So GHG automatically looks into our organization once you like get it running. So it actually looks into our organization, and if you see some developer is making a repository public, even though that code is proprietary to your organization, so it actually scans for all those repos and sees if anything is public, it makes them private right away. And then it alerts us as a security team in the end so that we kind of follows up with them. And then we have the exception management like it says. So if someone wants to make a repository open source, so you have to allow them. But then before doing that, we should have to do the credential scanning and all these security things that we have to do. So this is really helping us on that side too. So yeah.
All right, so we'll switch over to the demos real quick. So we'll start off with the AWS key management piece.
Yeah, so right now here you see this demo organization called GHG Open Source, and it got a lot of these repos, demo 1 to 3, GHG, and GG demo. Like once you set up the GHG tool and you start make it running, it actually scans for all the repos and then sends out an email saying that, okay, so this repo and this file contains the access key IDs and secret keys. So if you have a proper authentication to that repo as a owner or of that repo or as an owner of an organization, you can actually go into that file and then you can actually see those access key IDs that are actually like written as plain text in the code and then submitted into your organization. So this is what it does. It actually looks at it and sends you an email as a security team or the owner of your repository. And then this is for the multi-factor authentication enforcement. So we are trying to see that this is a non-enterprise account. So how can you add an user or invite someone to your organization? So it's just a simple thing. Like you can just say like, this is a user, can you add me to my organization? And you not know about his details, like whether he have MFA enabled on his account or does he have like proper like access and all. So you send him an invitation and then he accepts it. Till then you don't know his attributes, like whether he has MFA enabled or is he part of our organization or not. So you can't rely on a user sitting there waiting for someone to accept the invite and then look at him and say like, okay, so this guy doesn't have MFA, he doesn't follow the security policy, so we should remove him. So what it does is basically GHG automatically looks at all these users, like it is a time-based or event-based, you can actually set it up like that. Suppose you say like run every 1 hour or depending on whatever reason you have. So it actually looks at it and then see like once you get added to this the list of users, it actually finds out that there is no 2FA enabled on his account. And then in some time, like it actually scans for these users and removes him and then sends out an email to the user as well as you saying that this is the user who got removed and this is the reason why he got removed from your organization. So you can see that it get removed. And you can actually have the MFA whitelisted for some accounts, maybe if you want to use it for service accounts. Suppose you say, and then they want to use a hardware token or something, so they don't necessarily need a 2FA. So we are also providing that kind of capability here, and then you can see the notification there. Yeah, so this is one of the other features like we mentioned before, the private repos. So this is basically automating what a user or a security guy should work on every day, sitting at their organization account and looking for all these things. So here we are actually creating a repo, and suppose it is your organizational repo, so it contains your intellectual property, which you are adding to the repository. And if you are making it public, that's not good. So if you see demo 1 to 3 is not a private repository. So like I said, like if you make the GHG tool based on time-based or an event-based, it can actually go in and like look for all these repos and make it private automatically. So you don't need to go through it and then make it private or wait for someone to do it. Yeah.
Cool.
So these are all the capabilities of GHG and many more to come, but this is what we started with.
Cool. Thanks, Dileep. So we realize we're not the only company that's trying to solve these types of problems, and if anyone has any more use for this is why we decided to open source it. I think when we first started, it only solved a few use cases that were maybe niche plays and wasn't useful to maybe everyone, but at this point we developed it enough, we started getting a little feedback from other people we worked with in the community. They thought it was worthwhile that we actually shared this, so we decided we'd do that now. We still have a lot of improvements to be able to make and some more capabilities I'll be rolling out in the next few weeks and months or so, but I'm hoping that some people will get some use out of this at the current state it's at today. So, setup. So the requirements are pretty simple. It only takes about 5 minutes to actually set up. All you need is to have owner permissions for the GitHub account you're trying to manage. And then we use Amazon's SES service. If you're not familiar with SES, it's AWS's service for sending out emails to send out the notifications as well. We got some feedback that some people wanted to be able to set up like their own private SMTP server. I mean, that's cool, but we haven't, I think everyone else, when we said just use AWS, most people have AWS, even if it's a minor presence. They were cool with that too. So those are the only two things you need. There's some minor configurations that Dileep had mentioned that you'll have to actually consider. Do you want to be time-based? Do you want to be enforced or actually alert? A time-based, this is one that you can say, put it to 0. Make sure as soon as anyone adds in a repo that's public, you have to turn it to private immediately. Anytime a user adds into your organization that doesn't have MFA in place, make them actually kick them out if they don't have it. So we came out with some more feedback that some customers and some other people we're working with said like, well, we want to give them an hour or we want to give them a day or something else like that. I mean, being flexible, I mean, it's up to you to determine what's best for your organization and your use cases, but that's why we put a little bit of a timer in there instead of making it time-based instead of event-based. So a lot of customers, we found that was actually helpful. And if you're willing to live with that risk of having a user account without having MFA in place for a few hours, I mean, that's up to you guys to be able to decide that for your own. So with that, Dileep is going to take us to the demo for the setup and show you how simple it actually is.
I mean, we have a README text in our GitHub repository, so which is going to go through it, but it's just only this configuration file that you need to fill it. I mean, I know these are like why are you giving the plain text passwords here and then like plain access key IDs and secret access keys? But just for sake of my use, I did it. Like you guys feel free to like change the configuration file to like any safe or encrypted passwords in here. So it just needs to fill out this configuration file. And then you can run the modules independently. Like you can only run MFA module or you can only run the AWS key modules. We have that like flexibility of using separate modules. And thanks to GitHub, they are providing us the API, so you can use and leverage whatever you want.
Cool.
Yep.
And for everyone who's going to try, and I know looking at this right now and trying to access this SES account using this key, they're already expired. So I know you're still going to go ahead and try, but they're no longer.
Yeah, it says example in there. So yeah, better use it.
Take our word. That's
better use it.
Cool. All right, setup demo. So what's coming up next? One of the other features that we really liked from GitHub Enterprise was the ability to sync with Active Directory. So when actually someone leaves your Active Directory, which most organizations do a better job of managing that than their third-party applications, is that it'll automatically sync up and you'll be able to remove any of the accounts that are in GitHub based on your Active Directory status. So that's one of the other capabilities we're going to be looking to add in the next few weeks or months or so. The second round is API security, which I had mentioned before. Right now, I mean, key rotation is our focus, but if there's any other feedback or any other suggestions, we're always open to listen, because if you guys got the use cases, it might solve some of our problems too that we didn't even think about before either. So we're open for more suggestions on API security too. And then lastly, credential enforcement for encryption. With our environment, we haven't got to the point that we're able to reject commits based on plain text passwords being in place, but we've been very fortunate. We built enough awareness that it's not that big of a problem. We have a very few from time to time to actually have developers actually do this piece. So for us, it's an alert capability, and it's been good enough for us, but we're looking to move that into an enforcement capability as well too. Thank you guys. And I believe there might be time for questions. I think we went really early for this one.
Yeah.
That might be the only mic that we have.
Oh,
I can run the mic around.
cool. All right. All right.
Maybe you can elaborate on how you deal with false positives or, perhaps whitelisting. And an example I'll give is I have a cryptography library that I need to test key import from a bunch of different packages, old versions of OpenSSL and whatnot. And I actually recently was contacted by someone soliciting a bug bounty because they thought they found private keys in my repository, and they were looking for a payout for them telling me that this was somehow a security vulnerability. So I think this tool may suffer from a similar problem where there are actual cases where you do want private key material inside a repository in a unit test or something like that.
Yeah, you can probably use this one. Yeah.
I don't know if it is working.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, if I am understanding correct, how can we remove false positives? Suppose if it just says key in there and someone comes to you and say, this is actually a key or not, right? I guess that's what your question is, right? So, like we are doing right now, in the end, like what's next? When Josh was mentioning about it, he says credential encryption, right? Like once you encrypt or get into a pattern that says all of your keys, when you encrypt it, they comes with a cipher or something in there. So you actually look for non-cipher words within the keys and say this is not an actual false positive or a false positive. Like, you know what I'm trying to say, right? Like all these keys, if you make them either ciphered or encrypted and then get them to a same format, like it says started with a cipher or like after you encrypted it. So to get them into a single format, that will help you to reduce the false positives. As far as my concern, like, yeah, that's how we do. I mean, your question is right, because when I started, I have the same issues. But understanding my or our application configuration and say like all of these XML files only have the passwords because applications take all these from the XML files. So if it is coming from XML file saying that this is an alert saying that okay .xml file is having a plain text password, so then I'm like at least 90% sure that this might contain a password. And then on top of that, like once you encrypt it, and then since the application only takes the decrypted password, so it should come up with a format, and then when you decrypt it, it should be able to be understandable by the application. So try to get it into a specific format to get alerted. So which we are doing right now. We are not yet in that place. Yep. That's
cool.
Any more questions? Yep.
You mentioned stale account management. What are you doing right now, or what do you have plans to do in that regard?
Well, I mean, it's really around the Active Directory piece. We were able to better manage some of the capabilities around the MFA token, which would then hence kick you out of GitHub. But if you don't, that's not really a halfway solution. So it'll terminate the access, but it's not really practicing the data hygiene we wanted to be able to do. That's why the permanent solution, or I would say the real solution, is going to be the sync up with Active Directory. So it's very, very helpful right now, but we understand it's because it terminates the access, but it's not where we want to be.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. Cool.